At 6 a.m. on a crisp Monday, the roar of heavy machinery jolted me awake. I stumbled to the window and my heart stopped. The wooden bridge my grandfather crafted with his own hands in 1920, the only path to our family cabin, was being reduced to splinters by strangers wielding sledgehammers. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Darla Hensley, our HOA president, filming the chaos like she was directing a gritty reality show, smugly claiming it was for community safety. To me, it was nothing short of a declaration of war. What Darla didn't know was that shattering that bridge unleashed something ancient, something primal, and far beyond her control. In 2 weeks, she'd be live-streaming her own unraveling, knee-deep in a mess of her own making. Which city in the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you've had any run-ins with your HOA. We'd love to narrate your story on our channel. I threw on clothes and ran outside, my heart pounding as I watched century-old wood being smashed to pieces. The bridge wasn't just a structure to me. It was where my grandfather taught me to fish, where I scattered his ashes 5 years ago, where I planned to teach my own kids someday. Each piece of wood hitting the mud felt like someone was taking a sledgehammer to my childhood memories. Darla saw me coming and actually smiled, angling her phone so her viewers could see my shocked face in the background. "Good morning, Jake," she called out cheerfully. "Sorry about the early start, but this dangerous structure needed to come down immediately for community safety. I demanded to see the paperwork, the permits, any kind of authorization for this destruction." Her smile got even wider as she told her phone audience, "Some people just don't understand that community standards apply to everyone, even when it's inconvenient." She refused to show me any documents, claiming there had been an emergency HOA vote the night before to authorize the demolition. The problem was I never received any notice about an emergency meeting. I've lived in this community for 6 years since inheriting the cabin, and I've never missed an HOA meeting. I pay my dues on time, follow all the rules, and keep my property immaculate, but somehow, magically, there was an emergency vote about my bridge, and I wasn't invited. When I pointed this out, Darla just shrugged and said, "Well, maybe you should check your mail more carefully next time." The workers kept swinging their hammers while she kept filming, narrating the destruction like it was some kind of public service announcement. Unfortunately, some residents think sentiment should override safety regulations, but that's not how responsible communities work, she told her camera. The irony was incredible. This woman was talking about responsibility while literally destroying a piece of local history without proper legal authority. But I kept my cool because I knew getting angry on her live stream would only make me look like the problem. By the time I managed to get the police out there, the bridge was already completely destroyed. The officer was sympathetic, but explained that this appeared to be a civil HOA matter, not a criminal issue. "Unless you can prove they didn't have authority," he said, "there's not much we can do about a property dispute." I watched helplessly as the last pieces of my grandfather's handiwork were loaded into a dumpster like ordinary trash. Darla wrapped up her live stream with a satisfied smile, telling her viewers, "Sometimes being a community leader means making tough decisions, but Pine Lake is safer today because of our decisive action." She actually used the word decisive like she was some kind of military commander instead of an unemployed insurance adjuster who got elected HOA president because nobody else wanted the job. As her car disappeared down the street, I stood alone next to the pile of broken wood and rusted nails that used to be my family's bridge. The workers had left without cleaning up properly, leaving debris scattered across my property and into the lake. But as I looked at the mess, something clicked in my mind. Darla thought she was so smart, so powerful with her little live stream audience and her HOA authority. She had no idea what she'd just awakened. I walked back into the cabin and pulled out my grandfather's old surveying maps, the ones I had found in the garage after his funeral, the ones that showed exactly how the water flowed to Pine Lake, and more importantly, how it could be redirected. Darla wanted to play games with my family's legacy. Fine. But she was about to learn that some games have consequences she never saw coming. Looking at those faded maps, I realized I had something more powerful than any HOA authority. I had knowledge. I had time. And I had a century-old secret that could turn her little power trip into her worst nightmare. The next morning, I drove straight to the county office to check the legal status of my bridge. The clerk pulled up the records and confirmed what I already suspected. The bridge was built in 1923 with full permits, and as a grandfathered structure, it had every right to exist. Darla's emergency vote was completely invalid because proper notice wasn't given to all homeowners, which made the demolition illegal. The problem was, lawyers cost $500 an hour, and my bridge was already gone. I could file lawsuits and spend the next 2 years in court, but that wouldn't bring back my grandfather's work or stop Darla from finding new ways to harass me. I needed a different approach, something more immediate. That afternoon, I spent hours in my garage going through boxes of my grandfather's belongings that I'd never properly sorted. Most of it was old surveying equipment, faded maps, and handwritten notes about water flow patterns around Pine Lake. I remembered him mentioning something about water management when I was a kid, but I'd never paid much attention. Now studying his careful drawings and measurements, I started to understand that my grandfather hadn't just been a surveyor. He had been involved in designing the original water system that fed the lake. His notes mentioned an old control structure, somewhere in the woods behind my property, built during the 1940s to manage seasonal flooding. According to his maps, this structure controlled most of the water flow that kept Pine Lake at its current level. Following my grandfather's hand-drawn directions, I hiked 20 minutes through thick woods until I found what I was looking for. Hidden under decades of vine growth was a concrete building about the size of a large shed. The heavy metal door squeaked on rusted hinges as I pushed it open, and I had to use my phone's flashlight to see inside the musty chamber. Standing in the dim light filtering through broken vents, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice echoing in the concrete walls, telling me how water, if managed right, could change a town's fate. I remembered being 8 years old, sitting on his lap at this very kitchen table, watching him sketch water flow patterns with an old pencil stub and a thermos of coffee by his side. "Water's like people, boy," he'd said in his growly voice. "It always finds the easiest path, but sometimes you need to show it a better way to go." In that forgotten chamber, surrounded by the quiet genius of my grandfather's design, I felt his legacy press against the walls. Inside the structure, covered in rust, but still functional, was a massive wheel valve that looked like something from an old submarine. My grandfather's notes explained that this valve controlled the main feed pipe that diverted water from the natural creek system into Pine Lake. The wheel was enormous, nearly 3 feet in diameter, with deep grooves worn smooth by decades of his hands turning it to manage seasonal water flow. I could picture him here during spring floods and summer droughts, carefully adjusting the flow to keep the lake at optimal levels for the families who depended on it for their livelihoods and recreation. A quarter turn of the wheel slowed the creek to a trickle within minutes. When I tested it, I could actually see the water level in the creek drop noticeably, and I felt a surge of connection to the man who had taught me that knowledge and preparation were more powerful than any authority or wealth. While I was discovering my hidden weapon, Darla was escalating her attack. She posted another live stream that evening, standing next to the debris pile on my property with the setting sun creating dramatic shadows behind her. Day 2 of our problem neighbor ignoring the community cleanup order. she announced to her phone with theatrical indignation. Law Abbing residents shouldn't have to look at this eyesore indefinitely, and they definitely shouldn't have to tolerate someone who thinks rules don't apply to them. The next morning, I found a violation notice taped to my front door, demanding I remove all illegal bridge debris within 48 hours or face a $200 per day fine. The notice was printed on official HOA letterhead and signed with Darla's dramatic flourish, complete with underlined words for emphasis. She was trying to force me to clean up the mess her illegal demolition had created, essentially making me pay for my own property's destruction, while she portrayed herself as the reasonable authority figure trying to maintain community standard. That evening, I had an unexpected visitor. An older man approached my cabin just as I was finishing dinner, introducing himself as Wendell Bragg, with a firm handshake and kind eyes that reminded me of my grandfather. "I've lived here 20 years, he said, settling into the porch chair. I offered. "And I used to be on the HOA board before things got complicated." He explained that he'd been forced to resign his position 6 months ago after questioning some of Darla's increasingly aggressive decisions and demanding to see financial records that she claimed were confidential board business. "She didn't come up with the bridge idea herself," he told me quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "There's a rich guy in an expensive silver car who visits her every week. He gives the orders. She follows them like a trained dog." Wendell described a pattern I found deeply disturbing. Over the past 2 years, 3 other long-time residents had been systematically harassed by the HOA until they sold their properties and moved away in frustration and financial distress. Each time, the same expensive car appeared in Darla's driveway during the harassment campaigns, and each time the targeted families received generous cash offers just when the pressure became unbearable. The next evening, I positioned myself where I could observe Darla's house without being seen using binoculars from my grandfather's old surveying kit. Sure enough, at 7:30 sharp, a silver BMW pulled into her driveway like clockwork. For 90 minutes, I watched through the lenses as a well-dressed man in an expensive suit gestured and pointed, while Darla nodded enthusiastically, like an employee receiving detailed instructions from her boss. The body language was unmistakable. This wasn't a friendly neighbor visit or a casual social call. This was a superior giving specific orders to a subordinate who was eager to please and prove her worth. When the BMW left, I managed to catch the license plate number and committed it to memory. A quick online search revealed the car was registered to Harlan Mercer, a property developer who owned 4 lakefront mansions in our community, each worth over $1 million. Suddenly, everything made perfect sense. Darla wasn't some power-hungry HOA president acting on her own twisted sense of authority. She was a carefully controlled puppet being manipulated by someone with serious money and very specific goals for reshaping our entire community. Now I had 2 powerful tools. The hidden valve system that could control the lake's water level, with precision and knowledge about who was really behind the harassment campaign that had destroyed my family's bridge. The question was how to use them effectively. I could try fighting legally, but that would take months and cost thousands of dollars I didn't have, while giving Harlan and Darla time to escalate their attacks on other families. Or I could take more direct action using the advantages my grandfather had unknowingly left me through his decades of careful planning and community service. Standing next to that massive valve wheel, feeling the weight of its potential power, I thought about what he would do in this situation. He'd always told me that sometimes you can't wait for help to arrive, that sometimes you have to solve problems yourself with whatever tools you have available. Looking at the valve system he'd helped create, I realized I had a very powerful tool indeed. Harlan Mercer thought he could manipulate our community through his HOA puppet without anyone noticing or having the ability to fight back. But he had no idea that his entire million-dollar lakefront empire depended on water that flowed through a system I now controlled completely. Tomorrow I was ready to find out how much chaos a single twist of that old wheel could unleash. At 2 in the morning, I made my way through the dark woods to my grandfather's hidden valve station. The plan was simple: reduce the water flow by about 40% for just a few hours, then restore it before dawn, just enough to send a message without causing permanent damage. I turned the massive wheel slowly, listening to the change in water pressure as the flow decreased significantly. Within minutes, the creek that fed Pine Lake had slowed to less than half its normal volume. I set my phone alarm for 5:30 and headed home, wondering if anyone would even notice such a subtle change. By 7 in the morning, I had my answer. Multiple cars were pulling into Harlan Mercer's driveway, and I could see people walking around his private dock area, pointing at something. Through my binoculars, I realized what had happened. The lake level had dropped 6 in overnight, exposing the foundations of several expensive boat docks and leaving muddy rings around the shoreline. Harlan's pristine lakefront view now included 20 ft of exposed lake bottom that normally stayed underwater. The water level wasn't dangerously low, but it was visibly different enough to be alarming for someone who owned millions of dollars in lakefront property. The best part was watching Darla try to handle the crisis. She went live on her phone at 8:30, standing on Harlan's dock with the low water clearly visible behind her. "We're experiencing some kind of unusual environmental situation at Pine Lake this morning," she announced, trying to sound authoritative while obviously having no idea what was happening. This could be related to recent disruptions in our community ecosystem. Her viewers weren't buying it. The comments were filled with people asking practical questions like, "Did someone drain the lake?" and "Is this connected to that bridge thing?" One person even commented, "Calm as a beach," which made me smile despite the serious situation I was creating. By 9:15, I had restored the valve to its normal position, and the lake began returning to its regular level. This created an even more confusing situation for everyone except me. Darla had to explain to her livestream audience why the environmental crisis was mysteriously resolving itself with no intervention. Professional crews that Harlan had called for emergency assessment arrived to find the lake looking perfectly normal again. The whole thing made Darla look paranoid and incompetent, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. But more importantly, it got Harlan's attention in a way that clearly worried him. That afternoon, I got my first direct contact with the man behind the curtain. Harlan Mercer showed up at my cabin around 3:00, wearing an expensive suit and a fake friendly smile. "Hi there, neighbor. I'm Harlan Mercer. I own several properties around the lake. I heard you've been having some troubles with the HOA lately." He was smooth, I'll give him that. He expressed sympathetic concern about the bridge situation and suggested that maybe Darla had been overzealous in her community leadership. "Sometimes these HOA people get a little carried away with the power, he said, as if he hadn't been the one directing her actions. His solution was simple. He'd be happy to purchase my cabin for $150,000 cash, solving everyone's problems and allowing me to start fresh somewhere else without HOA hassles. When I politely declined his offer, explaining that the cabin had sentimental value as a family inheritance, his demeanor shifted slightly. He spent the next 20 minutes telling me about his vision for Pine Lake as an exclusive resort community. He talked about property values and development potential, making it clear that my rustic cabin didn't fit his upscale plans. "Sometimes sentiment has to take a back seat to progress," he said, still smiling, but with an edge to his voice. "I'm sure we can find a number that makes sense for everyone involved." The subtext was obvious: sell willingly now or be forced out. Later, through continued harassment, he left his business card and suggested I think carefully about his generous offer. That evening, Wendell stopped by to share more intelligence about Harlan's methods. He showed me copies of internal HOA communications he'd saved before being forced off the board. The pattern was clear. Harlan would identify properties he wanted, then use his influence over Darla to create harassment campaigns that made life miserable for the current owners. 3 families had already sold their homes at below-market prices just to escape the constant violations, fines, and community pressure. He's systematic about it, Wendell explained, creates problems, then shows up as the solution with a cash offer. The revelation made me angry, but it also gave me valuable insight into my enemy's strategy. I spent that night planning my next move. The morning's test had proven that I could affect Harlan's properties directly through the water system, and his immediate appearance at my door proved that he knew something was wrong. The fact that he came with a purchase offer instead of threats meant he was still trying the easy approach. But I knew from the other family's experiences that things would escalate quickly if I continued to refuse his offers. The question was whether to wait for his harassment campaign to intensify or strike first with something more dramatic than a 6-in water level drop. Looking at my grandfather's detailed maps of the water system, I realized I had options Harlan couldn't even imagine. He thought he was dealing with just another stubborn homeowner who could be bullied into submission. He had no idea he was facing someone who could literally control the foundation of his entire investment strategy. Tomorrow, I would show him exactly how vulnerable his lakefront empire really was. Saturday morning brought multiple luxury cars to Harlan's main property, which meant today was his big investor presentation. I had learned about it from Wendell, who still had contacts in the community. Harlan was hosting potential investors for a $5 million development deal that would transform Pine Lake into an exclusive resort community. The presentation included a catered lunch by the lakefront, yacht tours of the property, and detailed plans showing how much profit could be made from maximizing the area's potential. It was the perfect day to demonstrate exactly how fragile his lakefront paradise really was. At 10:00 in the morning, just as Harlan was welcoming his investors with champagne and panoramic lake views, I made my way to the valve station. This time, I wasn't planning a subtle test. I opened the valve system to divert 70% of the lake's water supply, creating a dramatic and visible drop in water level. From my position in the woods, I could see the investor group admiring the pristine lakefront setting, while Harlan gestured enthusiastically about property values and scenic beauty. They had no idea that the beautiful lake they were evaluating was about to become significantly less impressive over the next few hours. By 11:30, the changes were becoming obvious to anyone paying attention. The boat dock was starting to look unstable as its support posts became more exposed. Harlan's expensive yacht, which had been floating majestically in the background of his presentation, was beginning to sit awkwardly low as the water level dropped. I could see people pointing and talking, but Harlan kept trying to redirect their attention to his development plans and financial projection. He was working overtime to keep his investors focused on paperwork instead of the increasingly problematic view behind them. At noon, disaster struck in full view of everyone. The catered lunch was being served on Harlan's lakefront terrace when his yacht suddenly lurched sideways and settled into the mud with an expensive grinding sound. The lake level had dropped 18 in, transforming the elegant lakefront setting into an awkward scene of exposed mudflats and stranded watercraft. The investors immediately started asking questions about environmental issues, water rights, and whether this was normal for the area. Harlan tried desperately to explain it as a temporary environmental fluctuation that would resolve itself soon, but his credibility was evaporating along with his lake water. The situation got worse when Darla showed up to livestream the environmental crisis happening during Harlan's presentation. She positioned herself where her phone camera captured both the muddy disaster and the confused investors in the background, "We're experiencing an unprecedented environmental emergency at Pine Lake," she announced dramatically, apparently unaware that her broadcast was undermining Harlan's business deal in real time. The comments on her stream were brutal. Karma coming for the HOA queen, and maybe stop messing with people's property. One viewer even posted, "This looks like justice to me," which perfectly captured what I was hoping people would think. By 2 in the afternoon, the investors were making polite excuses and heading for their cars. Environmental concerns, water, rights issues, and questions about property values had effectively killed Harlan's $5 million deal. I watched from the woods as he stood alone on his muddy, yacht-stranded shoreline, probably calculating how much money had just evaporated along with his lake water. The beautiful lakefront paradise he'd been selling was now an expensive mud flat that smelled like rotting vegetation and broken dreams. His $1 million view had become a $1 million liability in the space of 4 hours. That evening, as the investor cars disappeared and Darla's live stream descended into confused rambling about environmental disasters, I quietly restored the water flow to normal levels. By morning, the lake would be back to its usual depth, making the whole incident seem even more mysterious and troubling for anyone trying to understand what had happened. Harlan would have no way to prove that the water loss was artificial and no way to guarantee his investors that it wouldn't happen again. I had effectively demonstrated that his entire lakefront empire was built on a foundation he didn't understand and couldn't control. Later that night, Harlan confronted me as I was checking my mailbox. Gone was the fake, friendly demeanor from our first meeting. "I know it was you," he said quietly, his voice full of barely controlled anger. "I don't know how you did it, but I know you're responsible for what happened today." I just smiled and suggested that maybe he should look into environmental causes for the lake's fluctuation. After all, I said, climate change affects water systems in unpredictable ways these days. What he didn't know was that my phone was recording our entire conversation, including his implicit admission that he suspected me of sabotage. He just made a huge mistake by revealing how much today's events had rattled him. Comment gotcha if you think Harlan just walked into his own trap because tomorrow the real war was about to begin. Harlan's retaliation came fast and brutal. By Monday morning, I was hit with 3 different lawsuits filed simultaneously, one for property damage, one for environmental sabotage, and one claiming I was mentally unstable and dangerous to the community. A private investigator started following me everywhere, taking photos of my daily activities and trying to find evidence of wrongdoing. Darla organized emergency community meetings about safety concerns regarding my behavior, painting me as an unhinged neighbor who posed a threat to everyone's property values. Building inspectors, noise complaint officers, and environmental officials showed up at my cabin almost daily with clipboards and official-looking paperwork. Darla's social media campaign against me reached new levels of intensity. She created a group called Pine Lake Safety Alert, where she posted daily updates about my supposed dangerous behavior. She went live 4 times a day, broadcasting from different locations around the lake while discussing how problem residents could destroy entire communities if left untouched. She went door to door with a petition to have me removed from the neighborhood, collecting signatures from people who barely knew me but were scared by her increasingly dramatic stories. She even started a hashtag called Pine Lake Problems with carefully edited photos that made my property look threatening and neglected. The final straw came on a Wednesday night when someone spray-painted Dar's neighbor across my driveway in large red letters. My security camera clearly showed Darla's car in the area at the exact time the vandalism occurred, but when I took the footage to police, they claimed there wasn't enough evidence to make an arrest. Even neighbors who had been friendly before started avoiding eye contact when I saw them at the grocery store. The constant harassment was working exactly as Harland had planned. I was being systematically isolated and vilified until selling my cabin would seem like the only reasonable option. That night, sitting alone in my grandfather's cabin, surrounded by legal papers and violation notices, I reached my breaking point. I was barely sleeping because of the stress, hardly eating because of the constant anxiety, and starting to wonder if maybe I should just sell and disappear to somewhere without HOA politics and manipulative developers. But then I found an old photo of my grandfather standing on the bridge he'd built, smiling proudly at his handiwork. Looking at that photo, I realized he hadn't built that bridge to create something that could be easily destroyed by bullies. He'd built it to last, to be something his family could depend on for generations. If Harland and Darla wanted to destroy everything my grandfather had worked for, they were going to learn that some fights are worth having, no matter how difficult they become. Sunday, at 4 in the morning, I made my way to the valve station. With a clear purpose, total warfare. This time, I wasn't planning a temporary demonstration or a subtle message. I opened all the valve systems to divert 95% of Pine Lake's water supply away from the lake indefinitely. The water level would drop 1 FT per hour until the lake was essentially empty, transforming every lakefront property from a premium asset into a worthless mudflat. I was done with subtle tactics and gentle warnings. If Harlan wanted to use overwhelming force to destroy my life, he was about to learn what overwhelming force actually looked like when applied to his business empire. By morning, the disaster was impossible to ignore. Joggers who regularly ran the lakefront path found themselves looking at an apocalyptic landscape of exposed lake bottom, stranded boats, and dead fish rotting in the sun. Expensive boats worth $50,000 or more were sitting in the mud like beached whales, their hulls already showing stress damage from the unnatural positioning. Harlan's million-dollar mansions, which had been marketed as exclusive lakefront property, now overlooked a stinking mudflat that stretched for hundreds of yards. The smell was horrific. Decades of organic matter that normally stayed underwater was now decomposing in the open air, creating an odor that could be detected from half a mile away. The media response was immediate and intense. Local news crews arrived by noon to cover the mysterious environmental disaster at Pine Lake. Helicopter footage of the completely drained lake went viral within hours, with environmental experts appearing on cable news to discuss possible causes for such a dramatic and sudden change. Scientists were baffled because there was no obvious explanation for the lake's disappearance. No drought, no pipeline breaks, no industrial accidents that could account for such massive water loss. The story became a national mystery that brought even more attention to Pine Lake and its suddenly worthless lakefront properties. The community's reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for: panic, blame, and complete chaos. Property owners watched their equity disappear in real time as potential buyers cancelled viewing appointments, and real estate agents stopped returning phone calls. Lake-dependent businesses like restaurants and boat rentals were forced to close, immediately creating a cascade of economic problems throughout the area. An emergency county meeting drew over 300 angry residents demanding answers and action, but nobody could provide either because nobody understood what was actually happening. Darla's live streams from beside the muddy wasteland were filled with viewers commenting karma and laughing emojis, destroying what remained of her credibility as a community leader. Harlan's response was pure desperation. He called every government agency he could think of, demanding emergency environmental investigations and immediate water restoration. He hired a crisis public relations firm to control the narrative and minimize damage to his reputation, but it's hard to spin away a completely empty lake when your business depends on waterfront views. He pushed for an FBI investigation into environmental terrorism, apparently hoping that federal resources might succeed where local authorities had failed, but most tellingly he also came to my cabin for another private meeting. This time, dropping the friendly pretense entirely and making it clear that he knew I was responsible for his disaster. The FBI did interview me about potential environmental sabotage, but I came prepared with complete documentation of my family's historical water rights dating back to 1898. I showed them my grandfather's original surveys, the legal basis for our water usage, and explained that I was actually restoring the natural water flow that had been artificially altered by illegal modifications over the years. When they investigated further, they discovered that Harland had been illegally modifying water systems for years without proper permits, essentially stealing community water to enhance his property values. The investigation quickly shifted focus from me to him, making me the protected whistleblower instead of the suspected criminal. As I watched the federal agents examine Harland's falsified permits, I realized his million-dollar empire had just become his prison. Hit the bell if you want to see justice finally served, because everything was about to come crashing down on the man who thought he could destroy my family's legacy. The community meeting that changed everything happened on a Thursday evening in the town hall, with over 200 residents packed into a space designed for half that many people. Wendell had spent weeks gathering evidence, and tonight he was finally ready to present the truth about what had been happening in Pine Lake. As he took the podium with a box full of documents, you could feel the tension in the room. People were angry, confused, and desperate for answers about why their community had been torn apart by lawsuits, harassment campaigns, and mysterious environmental disasters. Wendell started with the simple truth. Harlan Mercer has been stealing community water for years to artificially enhance his property values. He showed bank records proving that Harron had been paying Darla for her HOA cooperation in harassing specific homeowners. He revealed secret development plans that showed Harlan's real goal was to force out long-time residents so he could buy their properties cheaply and transform Pine Lake into an exclusive resort. The room erupted when Wendell read emails between Harron and Darla discussing how to create problems for families who refused to sell their homes willingly. The revelation hit the community like a tsunami. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who'd been forced to sell her family home last year after months of HOA harassment, stood up in tears. "I thought I was a bad neighbor," she said. "I thought I'd done something wrong to deserve all those violations and fines." One by one, other victims came forward with their stories. The Martinez family, who'd been cited for excessive noise when their children played outside. The Johnsons, who'd been fined for unapproved landscaping that had been approved the year before. The Williams, who'd been reported for disturbing the peace when they hosted their daughter's graduation party. Each story followed the same pattern: systematic harassment followed by a cash offer from Harron Mora to solve their problems. Darla's public breakdown happened in real time as the evidence mounted against her. She tried to live stream her side of the story, but it quickly devolved into a sobbing confession about being manipulated and used. "I thought I was protecting our community," she cried into her phone camera. "Harlan told me these people were bringing down property values and that we needed to maintain standards." She revealed additional details about Harlan's illegal activities, the secret pumps he'd installed to steal water from community sources, the bribes he'd paid to county officials for false permits, the threats he'd made against anyone who questioned his methods. Her former supporters abandoned her in the comments, with many expressing disgust at how they had been manipulated into attacking innocent neighbors. Harlan attempted damage control by hiring expensive lawyers and a public relations firm, but it's impossible to spin systematic fraud and community destruction into a positive story. His media interviews, where he tried to portray himself as another victim of environmental problems, fell flat when reporters started asking about the evidence Wendell had presented. His strategy of blaming everything on Darla backfired when She provided even more documentation of his illegal activities to prove she wasn't the mastermind behind the harassment campaigns. His desperate attempts to move money into hidden accounts were quickly discovered by federal investigators who were now taking a serious interest in his business practices. The national media attention transformed my story from a local dispute into a symbol of fighting back against powerful bullies who abused their wealth and influence. CNN picked up the story as a David versus Goliath environmental justice case, with documentary filmmakers wanting to capture the resolution of what they called the most dramatic neighborhood dispute in American history. Social media exploded with support for what people saw as a regular person standing up to corporate greed and corruption. Environmental groups hailed my actions as proof that individuals could make a difference when they fought back intelligently against systematic abuse. The legal consequences for Haaland came swiftly and decisively. Federal charges included environmental fraud, bribery, conspiracy, and legal modification of protected water systems. State violations encompassed permit fraud, theft of community resources, and systematic harassment of residents. Multiple families filed civil lawsuits seeking damages for the emotional distress and financial losses caused by his harassment campaigns. The HOA itself was dissolved entirely after investigations revealed that its elections had been rigged and its authority had been systematically abused for private profit. The lake restoration process revealed even more evidence of Haaland's crimes. When environmental teams examined the exposed lake bottom, they discovered illegal chemicals and artificial modifications that had been damaging the ecosystem for years. My drainage had actually exposed environmental damage that might never have been found otherwise, providing additional evidence of Haaland's disregard for both legal requirements and community welfare. Scientists studying the restoration process concluded that my actions had inadvertently helped the environment by removing harmful artificial elements that had been disrupting the lake's natural balance. The community transformation was remarkable to witness. New leadership emerged through democratic elections with transparency rules ensuring that all meetings would be public and all decisions would be made collaboratively. Haaland's mansions were seized by the government for environmental restitution, with the properties being converted into community spaces and affordable housing. Wendell was elected as interim community coordinator, bringing decades of institutional knowledge and a commitment to preventing future abuse of power. Property owners who had suffered under Haaland's harassment campaigns finally felt safe in their own neighborhood again. As the evidence mounted and the legal walls closed in around Haaland, I prepared for the final act of this drama. Tomorrow morning, I would restore the lake's water supply in a community ceremony that would symbolize our recovery from months of manipulation and abuse. But first, I had planned one final surprise that would ensure Haaland's downfall was as public and humiliating as the damage he had caused to so many innocent families. Share this if you believe karma always wins, because justice was about to flow back into Pine Lake along with the water. The morning of the restoration ceremony brought over 300 residents to witness the return of water to Pine Lake. News crews had set up equipment to capture what they were calling a community healing event, while documentary filmmakers positioned cameras to record the symbolic end of our nightmare. I stood next to the valve wheel that my grandfather had helped install decades ago, surrounded by neighbors who just weeks before had been afraid to make eye contact with me. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and the promise of justice finally being served. As I prepared to turn the valve and restore our lake, federal agents arrived with a warrant for Haaland's arrest. The timing was perfect. Just as our community was about to celebrate renewal and healing, the man who had caused so much damage was being led away in handcuffs. The charges were read aloud in front of everyone: environmental fraud, bribery, conspiracy to commit harassment, and illegal modification of protected water systems. Watching him take that humiliating perp walk past all the people he'd tried to manipulate and control was more satisfying than any revenge I could have imagined. The cameras captured every moment of his downfall, ensuring that his disgrace would be preserved forever. With Harlan in custody, I slowly turned the massive valve wheel as the crowd cheered. Clear, clean water began flowing back into the empty lake bed, creating a sound like freedom itself returning to our community. Children, who had been too young to understand the political drama, still recognized the magic of watching water return to where it belonged. Adults who had lived through months of harassment and fear finally felt like they could breathe freely in their own neighborhood again. The time-lapse footage captured by news crews showed life literally returning to Pine Lake. Fish swimming back into their habitat, birds returning to the shoreline, and boats floating properly for the first time in weeks. Darla's court-ordered public apology live stream was the final piece of accountability that our community needed. Standing in the mud where she had once wielded power so carelessly, she confessed to her remaining viewers about being manipulated by Harlan and apologizing for the damage she had caused to innocent families. The comments on her stream were a mixture of forgiveness from those ready to move forward and continued anger from those whose lives had been seriously disrupted by her actions. By the end of the week, she had sold her house and moved away, unable to face the community she had helped tear apart. The bridge reconstruction became a community-wide volunteer project that brought everyone together in a way we'd never experienced before. Over 50 neighbors offered labor, materials, and expertise to rebuild something better than what had been destroyed. We used some of the original wood from my grandfather's bridge in a memorial section while building the rest to modern safety, standards that would satisfy any legitimate HOA concerns. The dedication ceremony included a plaque recognizing not just my grandfather's contribution, but the entire community's resilience in overcoming systematic bullying and manipulation. The environmental impact of our ordeal turned out to be surprisingly positive. Removing Harlan's illegal modifications and artificial water systems actually improved the lake's natural ecosystem. Wildlife populations increased beyond their previous levels. Water quality improved dramatically, and the natural balance that had been disrupted for years was finally restored. Universities sent research teams to study our restoration as a model for other communities dealing with environmental damage caused by illegal development practices. Tourism actually increased as people came to see the David versus Goliath Lake, where regular citizens had successfully fought back against corporate corruption. The legal resolution brought justice for everyone who had suffered under Harlan's systematic harassment. His seized assets funded an environmental restitution program that compensated families for their losses and paid for ongoing water quality monitoring. The 3 families who had been forced to sell their homes received financial settlements that allowed them to buy back their properties or relocate with dignity. A new community governance structure was established with strict transparency requirements and democratic oversight to prevent future abuse of power by anyone seeking to manipulate our neighborhood for personal gain. 6 months later, I stood on the rebuilt bridge at sunset, watching the clear water reflect the sky in perfect stillness. Families were enjoying evening activities around the lake. Children were playing safely in their yards, and neighbors were talking to each other like human beings instead of viewing each other as threats. My grandfather's legacy had been not just preserved, but strengthened by our community's response to those who tried to destroy it. The phone in my pocket buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Prescott, our HOA is terrorizing our neighborhood in Arizona. Can you help?" Looking out at our peaceful, restored lake, I realized this story was just the beginning of something much larger. Justice doesn't always come quickly, but it flows like water toward those who have the patience and courage to guide it in the right direction. Sometimes standing up to bullies requires more than just moral courage. It requires intelligence, preparation, and the willingness to use whatever tools are available to protect what matters most. My grandfather's hidden valve system had given me the power to fight back. But it was our community's willingness to unite against corruption that had made real change possible. Pine Lake was more than just restored, it was transformed into proof that ordinary people can defeat even the most powerful enemies when they work together with wisdom and determination. As the sun set over our peaceful lake, I smiled and answered that text from Arizona. "Tell me about your water situation," and I typed back, because sometimes justice needs a little engineering help to flow where it belongs, and I was just getting started helping communities learn how to defend themselves against those who abuse power for profit. Water always finds its level, and so does justice when good people are willing to guide both where they need to go